Okay, so finally, A&P, Anatomy and Physiology. The first part we focused on chemistry and cells, and now, if you remember the organization of life, how living things are organized. First of all, living things start off at the cellular level, right? Well, the cellular level is where life begins. So cells are made up of what? Organelles, which are made up of macromolecules, which are made up of molecules and atoms. So as we go ahead, cells come together to make up what? The tissues. Okay, and the tissues come together to make up organs. And then the organs work together within a organ system, good. And then the organ systems work together to make the complete organism. Right. So we're on chapter 4, so we're still at the start of the bottom, and we're working our way up. So with tissues, so first you know that tissues are made up of cells, groups of cells, right? Cells and cell products. And so tissues are made up of cells and cell products. By cell products, that just means whatever the cell makes and may send out to the extracellular space. Okay, so histology is study of tissues. And again, a tissue is a collection of similar cells that group together to perform a specialized function. Okay, so in the last chapter we saw that there are many, many different types of cells, and the cells have in common a nucleus and organelles and cytoplasm. So it has all those features that are the same, but the different cells of different parts of the body have different functions. So their structures are slightly different. So if you have a tissue, that tissue is going to be made up of a collection of cells that are similar in structure and function, and their job is to do some type of work. Just off the top of my head, for example, the heart. So all organs are made up of what? Tissue. Okay? So the main type of tissue of the heart would be muscular, right? Okay? So muscular tissue, all of the cells of the heart, for the most part, are similar types of cells. Okay? So what we'll do, the way I would like for you all to kind of think of this chapter is to focus on what those 4 main categories are of tissues. The 4 main tissue categories or classifications. And they are epithelial tissue, sometimes just called epithelium, I-M instead of A-L. Anybody know what A-L means on the end of a word? Medical terminology students. A-L at the end of a word, and you see it a lot. You'll see. I'll bring it up when we see them, but quite a few medical terms will have A-L on the end. Cerebral, right? So, any idea what cerebral, what that word means? I sometimes hear saying that person is cerebral. What does that mean? Smart. So yeah, it has something to do with the brain. Okay, so, and this is just medical terminology, so you all won't get thrown off when you see words like this. So if you see the word cerebrum, write that down. Cerebrum, C-E-R-E-B-R-U-M. R-E B-R-C-E-R-E B-R-U-M. So this is why you all should take a course like medical terminology, because you'll see a word, and if you have an idea what the word part means, then you can figure out the whole word. So the word cerebrum, the cerebrum is what? The brain, the big part of the brain. Okay, so the cerebrum, that's what that is called, the cerebrum. So if you take off the UM and add AL, it still is referring to the cerebrum, but the AL means pertaining to. Okay? So cerebral, and I'll give you an example of how cerebral will be used. Cerebral hemispheres. Cerebral hemispheres. Just because the cerebrum has two sides, right? Two halves. So it's split down the middle, pretty much. So instead of saying cerebrum hemispheres, that doesn't make sense. You have to change the UM to AL because it's pertaining to the cerebrum. So epithelial, the reason I'm bringing this up is because students will see epithelium on the test and think, what is that? It's referring to epithelial. Okay, epithelium mean the same thing, except one is pertaining to the epithelium. Okay, so we'll go over the epithelial tissues first, and each of these has subclasses, and that's probably the most challenging for you all to remember. In this chapter, connective tissue, there are more different types of connective tissues than the others. Then we have muscle tissue, and we'll see the 3 types of muscle tissue, and then finally nervous tissue. So these are the 4 main groups or categories of tissues, body tissues. And tissues, again, are made of what? Groups of cells, similar cells, and their cell products. Good. Okay. So this is another subset, just giving you an idea of which organs belong in those tissues. Okay, muscle tissue, epithelium, connective, and nervous. So when we think of epithelial tissues form a protective covering for the body. So the epithelial tissues usually either cover or line organs. And we'll also see that epithelial tissue is the main type of tissue found on the outer surface of skin. So in the lab exam you all had last week, you had the picture of the skin. What was the outer part of the skin called? Right, so the epidermis. And what is epi again? Right, so EPI, prefix means above or upon. So epithelium is usually covering. And so the epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. What's the layer beneath the epidermis? The dermis is actually made of connective tissue. Okay, so epithelium is the main tissue of the outer layer of skin, being the epidermis. The epithelial tissue will also find in membranes, so they form the membranes. The ducts, which we'll talk about as being part of glands. So some glands are made of ducts, and those ducts are made from epithelial tissue. Lining of body cavities and hollow organs. So again, most of these are going to be either lining an area of the body or covering. The layers of cells adhere closely to one another, so the cells are in contact with each other. In other words, there's a difference between having a tissue and you have cells scattered out but a lot of space in between, In epithelial tissue, you don't have much space between cells. They're all kind of scrunched in together. And we'll see a picture. Make sure you know and understand these, because on the test, what I'll be asking you is, what are some differences between epithelium and connective tissue especially? Okay, so that epithelial tissues have cells that are close together. We'll see that connective tissue has cells that are spaced apart. There's more space, in which we call matrix, in connective tissue than there is in epithelial tissue. All epithelium is going to have flat sheets of cells with the upper surface exposed. And I'll show you a picture of that so it'll make sense to you. And there's a flat sheet. I like to think of it as like carpet. If you look at carpet, the top surface of the carpet is kind of what you're thinking about here when you say it says a flat sheet. So epithelial tissue is a flat sheet. The upper surface of the cells are exposed to the environment or an internal body cavity. And then on the bottom here, you see it says epithelium rests on a basement membrane. So if you think of carpet, the carpet is what's holding the cells to it, to the bottom of it. So the basement membrane is like what anchors the parts of the carpet in place. Then you have avascularity. So the epithelial tissues are said to be avascular. Write that word down because I don't see it on here. And you may see that word on the test. Avascular. A-V-A-S-C-U-L-A-R.
A-V-A-C-U-L-A-R.
A-V-A. Yeah. So avascular. Anybody know what vascular refers to?
Circulation. Circulation.
Yeah, but specifically blood vessels. So vascular is referring to vessels. So if something is avascular, what does the prefix A usually mean? Without. So avascular means epithelial tissues don't have blood vessels. Okay, so what would be strange about that? What would be strange about a tissue that doesn't have blood vessels? What is the importance of blood vessels? That's the only way the body has to deliver what? Oxygen and nutrients. Okay, so does that make sense to you? So my skin, the top layer, doesn't have blood vessels to it. So how is my epithelium getting supplied with oxygen and nutrients so those cells continue to live? Good. So two things. One thing, the cells do die. Right? That's why they die. The epithelium grows from the base out. So the new cells are down here, connected to what? The dermis, or the basement membrane, which is glued to the dermis. Okay, the dermis has blood vessels. In fact, it's highly vascular. So the nutrients just diffuse from the dermis to those cells on the base of the epidermis. Okay, and as cells get further away from that nutrient source, they die. So that's why our skin dies, but that's an important point to keep in mind. The epithelial tissues do not have blood vessels. In other words, they are what? Avascular. Good. Okay, so we'll focus on epithelial tissues here. One thing I want you all to be able to recognize are some of the differences between these tissues when you look at them under a microscope. So first of all, when naming epithelial tissues, they always have two names, the first name and the last name. And the first name is always one of these: squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. So those are the first names, the possible first names of epithelial tissue. And what do those words mean? Squamous means flat cells. So what we're looking at here, again, is tissues are made up of what? Cells. And if those cells are flat, then we call that epithelial tissues the squamous tissue. If the cells of the epithelial tissue are cube-shaped, then they're going to be called cuboidal tissue or cuboidal epithelium. Then the last type, cell shape, is columnar. And these are tall, narrow cells. And I'll show you a picture of all three in just a moment. So those are the first words. The second word, or second name, last name, is simple or stratified. Okay, and we have one exception here. So the classification by arrangement, simple and stratified. Simple means what? One layer of cells. So again, think of the carpet. And the carpet has just one layer of cells. Then that would be called simple squamous or simple cuboidal or simple columnar, depending on the shape of that one layer of cells. And then you have stratified. Stratified means what? Two or more layers of cells. So if there are two or more layers, the tissue is said to be stratified epithelium. And then pseudo-stratified, what does that prefix pseudo mean? False. So that means it's false stratified. What does that mean? It probably means it looks like it's more than one layer, but it's really only one layer of cells. Okay? So, now, before we go to the next slide where we have the pictures of them. So, all of the epithelial that we're going to talk about are going to have either simple or stratified as the first name, and squamous, cuboidal, and columnar as the second name. And then we'll see that there's one type of pseudostratified and also something called a transitional epithelium. Those are the main names that you need to be aware of. All right, so the picture at the bottom. So you have the classes of epithelium, and you can see that remember epithelial tissues, the cells are very close together, so you really don't see any space between those cells. And so this is called simple. Why? Because there's just one layer of cells connected to that basement membrane. So remember, all epithelium has cells that have apical surface, and the bottom of the cells are connected to the carpet, okay, the basement membrane. And look all the way on the end. So stratified, why is that one called stratified on the end? Okay, so you can see looks like about 4 layers, 4.5 in the picture. So that would be stratified epithelium. And in the middle, that one is pseudostratified. What makes it appear that there's more than one layer? Right, some of the cells don't extend all the way to the top. So if you're looking under a microscope, if you notice simple, all the nuclei are right at the same level. So when you look at it under a microscope, you see all the nuclei there. But here, you see nuclei at different levels. So it appears, when you look at it that way, that there's more than one layer. Okay, so pseudostratified, that means all of the cells of the tissue are connected to the basement membrane. Okay? So in stratified, are all of the cells connected to the basement membrane? No. Okay? So you may see something like that on the test. Pseudostratified and pseudostratified are all of the cells connected to the basement membrane versus simple and stratified epithelium. Okay? Then you have the cell shapes again, squamous or flat cells, cuboidal, cube-shaped, and columnar, tall and thin cells. All right, two main types of epithelium based on their location, where they're located in the body. Covering and lining epithelia on the external and internal surfaces, and then glandular epithelium, which makes up the glands. Okay, so on each of these slides, you're going to see a description. Well, first, the name of that epithelial tissue, a description, function, and location. Okay. Now, and this really was the most difficult part because there are really so many locations, and I'm not really concerned about you all learning all of those. I think what I did is in the study hints, I tell you which ones that I want you to know their location. And I'll stress those in the lecture as well. So here's the first type of epithelium, simple squamous epithelium. So that name alone tells you what about this tissue? Simple tells you what? So there's one layer of what? One layer of cells, and the squamous tells you that there's one layer of flat cells. Good. Okay, so the description is pretty easy. Function allows passage of materials by diffusion and filtration in sites where protection is not important, and secretes lubricating substances in the serosa. Okay, a couple things there. For any of the tissues that are simple, one layer, a lot of times their function is going to be one of these, like diffusion, filtration. Let me see if I can give you all a good example. So diffusion. Why would the process of diffusion benefit from a single layer of cells versus several layers of cells? Right, so our lungs, for example. So what is it that our lungs do for us? Right, so oxygen comes from the atmosphere into our lungs, and then from the lungs, what? Into the bloodstream, right? Because that oxygen has to be taken all over the body. Well, how is the oxygen getting from my lung tissue into my bloodstream? By diffusion. So it's a lot easier for that diffusion if the cells are only one cell layer thick, because the oxygen would have to diffuse through too much in order to get to the bloodstream, and that wouldn't work. So we'll see diffusion usually having to do with the one layers of cells, filtration. Okay, and it says in sites where protection is not important. So that means where there's no abrasion. So if there was abrasion in an area, you wouldn't want one layer of cells, right? Because any abrasion may just wipe away that one layer of cells. Okay? So let's look at a couple of places. In the air sacs of the lungs, the lining of the heart, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels. So remember we talked about pericardium, visceral pericardium, parietal pericardium. Those are made of simple squamous epithelium. Okay. Two other locations, you have endothelium and mesothelium, the lining of the lymphatic vessels, blood vessels, and the heart. So the inner lining of the heart, the chambers are lined with endothelium, and also the innermost layer of the blood vessels. The blood vessels are in the blood is in direct contact with the endothelium of a blood vessel. So blood vessels in the heart, and then mesothelium is epithelium of serous membrane in the ventral body cavity. And those are the ones you all learned. Pericardium, right? You have visceral and what? Parietal, pericardium. Then you have parietal pleura and visceral pleura. So those membranes are referred to as mesothelium. Simple cuboidal. The name tells you what about the tissue? One layer of cube-shaped cells. Okay? And the function of these tissues is primarily secretion and absorption. Secretion and absorption. What do those two terms mean to you? Secretion Yeah, so just release of some substance. So in tissues that are releasing fluids or other substances, such as glands. And what is absorption? But in the body, you all should always know that absorption is referring to things entering the bloodstream. Okay? Absorption. And you may hear reabsorption of fluid back into the bloodstream. Okay, so then you have simple columnar epithelium. Simple columnar. That tells you what? Simple. One layer of column, tall, narrow cells. Now look at the picture. Here's the thing. When you look at the picture, can you tell? And this one, you really can't tell what you're looking at. But this is actually a picture of the air sacs and lung tissue. So the air sacs are pockets of space. And what you see here are the cells. Okay, so these are the squamous, the flat cells of the simple squamous epithelium. And notice how those cells look different from these. So these are supposed to be cube-shaped. In the picture, can you see cube-shaped cells? And what's the other thing we said about epithelium? That it has an apical surface, right? Do you see an apical surface on any of these? Right, so if you just take any of these circles, these are individual cube-shaped cells. And this would be their apical surface. Okay, so the space in the very center of those is the apical surface. And then you see the basement membrane attaches it to the rest of the tissue. Okay, simple columnar, so these are pretty easy. You can see that they're all tall and thin cells. And those make up the digestive system, primarily. And then they're pseudostratified. Usually this one is referred to as pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium because they have cilia at the apical surface of the cells. You have cilia there. And so why again is that called pseudostratified? The other way. Right, so it appears to be more than one layer of cells. And the reason why is because, again, you have the nuclei at different levels. So it appears that way, but what we know is that all of those cells are in direct contact with the basement membrane. So it's not quite stratified. Function, secretion, particularly of mucus, propulsion of mucus by ciliary action. And we find this in our respiratory tract, in the trachea. Remember, the cilia helps to push the debris up to the throat so it doesn't get down into the lungs. Okay? Pseudostratified. And now stratified squamous epithelium. So this is a thick membrane composed of several layers of cells. The basal cells, the cells at the base of the tissue, are cuboidal or columnar. So why are they called stratified squamous? If we just said that the cells at the base are columnar, and you have cube shape. So whenever you have more than one layer, the second part of the name is based on the shape of the cells at the surface. So in stratified squamous epithelium, the cells at the surface are the ones that are flat. And that's why it's given that name. Function, protection. Protects underlying tissues and areas subjected to abrasion. For example, non-keratinized types form the moist lining of the esophagus. Where's your esophagus? What does it do? So what do you know about it? So you know it's somewhere in there. What system is it part of? So the digestive system. So its job is to what? Right. Delivers food from the oral cavity to the stomach. Okay? So what did it say about stratified squamous? Protects underlying tissues in areas subject to abrasion. So the esophagus is subject to abrasion? How? Yeah. So when you eat, take a big bite of that Big Mac, it's going to push down and rub against the wall of the esophagus. So if you just had one layer there, that would be the end of it. So that is therefore protecting the esophagus. And in the mouth, the oral cavity, same reason, vagina, and the epidermis of the skin, and also dry membranes. Okay. So stratified cuboidal and columnar are fairly rare. And then the last type of epithelium is transitional. So transitional means what? Yeah, sort of like that. So temporary, or it changes, some type of change occurs. So in transitional epithelium, these are found in areas or organs that stretch. So by stretching transitional epithelium, the surface cells, remember, they're named for the shape of the surface cells, the cells at the surface. And those surface cells will flatten out as the transitional tissue is stretched. Okay? So stretching causes those cells to flatten. And when there's no stretching, the cells are more cube-shaped. And we find these in the lining of the ureters, the urinary bladder. So if you imagine the urinary bladder, when your bladder is full, that's stretching the tissue, right? So if your bladder is full, you would expect for the transitional apical cells to be what? Flat. Okay? If your bladder is empty, then it's not stretched and the apical cells are cube-shaped. Okay? All right. Glands. So you should know what glands are. A gland is an organ specialized to produce a substance for use elsewhere in the body or to release them for elimination from the body. Okay, so that's what glands are. So any gland, its job is to make some substance and then secrete that substance. Okay, which may go into the bloodstream or it may go to the surface of the skin like sweat glands. So that is by definition what glands are. And glands are classified by the site of product release, so whatever the glandular tissues are making, where is it going to be released? Into the bloodstream or on the surface of the skin, for example. So that's what we mean by endocrine versus exocrine. So endo versus exo. See those prefixes? Endo meaning inside or within. Exo, outside. Right. So endocrine glands. Any idea? Can you name any endocrine glands? The pancreas? Yeah. Thyroid gland, right. So the thyroid gland is an example of an endocrine gland. So what do all endocrine glands do? Release their stuff directly into the bloodstream. So it goes everywhere. And that stuff is called what? Hormones. Okay, so the endocrine glands make hormones and then send those hormones directly into the bloodstream. Whereas exocrine glands, such as sweat glands, oil glands, they secrete outside of the body mainly. That's why it's called exocrine. But then there are some exocrine glands that secrete into a hollow organ, such as the stomach or intestines. Okay? So endocrine glands, they all secrete into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands secrete to the outside of the body or into the lumen of an organ, such as a digestive organ. An example of that is the chemicals that break down your food, those enzymes. And those enzymes come from the pancreas, which has both an endocrine and exocrine function. But the pancreas delivers insulin into the bloodstream. The pancreas delivers lactase enzyme into the digestive tract. So one would be an exocrine function, the other would be endocrine. All right. So they're also classified. Glands are also classified by the relative number of cells forming the gland. So some glands are unicellular, so just one cell is producing and secreting the material, and then others are multicellular glands. So most of them are multicellular. And this goes through some of the differences. So you will need to know the differences between endocrine and exocrine glands. Glands are composed of epithelial tissue inside of a connective tissue framework or capsule. So again, exocrine glands maintain their contact with the body's surface by way of a duct. So one of the things you'll see is which type of glands have ducts and which do not. Exocrine glands have ducts. The endocrine glands are ductless, have no ducts. What do we mean by ducts? So if I, sort of like pores, passageway. So if this is a sweat gland, you all remember the picture where you had a sweat gland in the skin. and the surface of the skin was up here somewhere. So here's the surface of the skin. So in order for the gland to get its secretion to the skin, the secretion has to pass through this duct first. So this is a duct. Okay, so the duct is just the passageway for the secretion to make it to the surface of the body with the sweat or inside the intestines if it's, for example, from the pancreas, the digestive enzyme. Okay, so exocrine glands have ducts, endocrine glands do not. Endocrine glands secrete a substance called hormones, and that hormone goes directly into the bloodstream. And again, some organs have both endocrine and exocrine function, such as the pancreas, as we just mentioned, liver, and gonads as well. Okay. What was the third one? Gonads and pancreas. What are gonads? What are gonads? Right. Ovaries and testicles. All right. Exocrine glands, mucus, sweat, oil. Let's take a break here.